All right, now we're going to look at doing that vulnerability assessment. How do you assess your vulnerabilities? Well, there is the idea of vulnerability research. We're going to analyze protocols, analyze surfaces, look at our configuration, and see if there are vulnerabilities, design flaws that are on all of our systems, our applications, our operating systems. We want to make sure that there are not vulnerabilities that can be exploited, attacked, misused. So we're going to do vulnerability research, classifying vulnerabilities that we find by security level, low, medium, and high, and the exploit range. In other words, can somebody exploit this vulnerability over the internet remotely, over the network remotely, or is it a local exploit? And so we're going to gather information, look at security trends and threats, look at the attack surface, different vectors that an attacker can use to attack, the techniques that they can use. Then we're going to move that into trying to find specific weaknesses in our applications, one application at a time. Usually you're going to use some automated processes, but also in order to explore more deeply, you'll use manual processes. Both of these work. And we want to be able to alert the network administrator before a network attack happens. That's why we're doing vulnerability research. We're going to gather information to prevent the security issue from happening before it takes place. We want to also know how to recover from a network attack because we understand the nature of the vulnerability, how the attack took place, and so we might be able to reverse the damage from the attack. So for vulnerability research, there are many places to go, and what I would urge you to do is maybe at some point after right now, pause and go and visit some of these. Like for instance, one that I would recommend is dark reading. Maybe you don't even have to pause. You could just open up a tab and type in darkreading.com and check that out. Very good place to find out what's going on in terms of attacks that are happening. Another one I recommend, Pen Test Magazine. If you can, through your company or afford a subscription to it, very good information from there. SC Magazine. Also, you should be able to use and be familiar with the Google hacking database, the exploit database, exploit-db.com. Security Focus. HackerStorm is another very good one. Computer World, Security Tracker, many different areas where you can do vulnerability research. Find out what is vulnerable, what is being attacked right now, and if your systems or your organization are running systems, applications with these vulnerabilities, you fix them first before the attack happens. So beyond research, the next thing we want to be able to do is called the vulnerability assessment, and it's an in-depth examination of the vulnerabilities of your systems, your applications. You're going to measure, classify those systems. You're going to identify weaknesses, and then you're going to predict whether or not security measures are effective. So just very simply, for instance, I look through a system and I find that this system has port 23, which is Telnet, and port 80 open. And then what we do is we go back through and we close, block port 23 and port 80, and then we go back through and run our assessment again to prove that those are closed and blocked, right? So we took the security measure to protect the system. Now we go and predict the effectiveness of the security measure. So one of the things that we can find, one of the really cool outcomes, is that we get information from the vulnerability scan. We get the OS, we get the versions of the vulnerability scan. We get open ports and running services from the vulnerability scan. We get applications and service vulnerabilities, applications and service configuration errors. We get applications accounts that may have weak passwords. We find applications and operating systems that may have missing patches and hot fixes. We get all of that from running the scan and finding if those vulnerabilities exist or not. So with vulnerability scanning approaches, there are two approaches to network vulnerabilities. One is active, the other is passive. So with active, you directly interact, you craft probes. So like for instance, I can use a tool like Nmap, and I can craft a probe like Nmap. I can do a dash lowercase s, uppercase s, and put a space in there, and then do a dash a, which pulls out all of the information I can get out of a system. Like for instance, it gives me a basic vulnerability scan. And then I can do a dash T5, capital T, number 5, which will make it as aggressive as possible. And then I can put in a range of IP addresses and hit enter. And it'll go through and aggressively scan the entire range of IP addresses, finding vulnerabilities for me, open ports for me, and other information. So something like that, yeah, sending that probe, specifically crafted requests. I can do that with Nmap, I can do that with HPing3, or with an automated full vulnerability scanner. Or I can passively scan the network by listening to what's going on with the network, watching connections, examining TCP using a sniffer or some other type of passive scan. So a couple different ways to do vulnerability scanning. Once we are taking in these vulnerabilities, if we find them listed in a vulnerability database, we'll also find the CVSS ratings. CVSS stands for Common Vulnerability Scoring System. Usually you're going to be looking at the 3.0 rating. So keep in mind that there's a range, a base score, like for instance, low is 3.1 to 3.9, medium is 4.0 to 6.9, etc. And so this is the rating of the vulnerability that you'll find. And there are many different vulnerability databases. One of these is CVE, the Common Vulnerability and Exposures Database from NVD. And these are just some listings of the CVEs. This one is Adobe Dreamwear version 19.0 and earlier have an insecure protocol implementation vulnerability. Successful exploitation could lead to sensitive data exposure if SMB requests is subject to a relay attack. So what does that mean? What does that mean? This is what it means. Let's say that I'm an attacker. I am scanning a network that I want to attack. I find a system that's running Adobe Dreamwear 19.1 or 19, actually it should be 19.0. It says 19.0 and earlier. So let's say that it's 18.7. Adobe Dreamwear. I may not even know what Adobe Dreamwear is, but I know how to look for vulnerabilities in the versions of the software that I find running on systems. So I check Adobe Dreamwear and I find that there's a CVE 2019 7097, and I find that it can be attacked. And so what I do then is I can go, for instance, to the Google Hacking Database and do a search on this, and I might find that there is a current exploit with code that allows me to take advantage of Adobe Dreamwear 18.7 or whatever I said it was, and get information dumps from that network, from that host or whatever, right? So just knowing the version, see what I mean by the version? Look at this, Druide, I don't even know how to pronounce it. Let's zoom in on it. That's Druide Antidote RX HD, 8 before 8.5, 9 before 9.5, etc. 10 before, what's the problem? NTLM hashes, etc. So I don't know. I think I've heard of Druide Antidote RX, but I really don't know what that is. I don't care if I know what that is. You know why? Because if I scan a network and I find that they're running Druide Antidote RX, they're running 8.1. No, 8.04, right? Because it has to be before 8.05. I know that it's vulnerable to something in CVE 19, this entire CVE here, so I'm not going to read the whole thing. And there are plugins, there's Active Directory domain. There's a vulnerability that I can take, I can run, hack away at it. It's already listed here. It's already there. It's already scored, right? So somebody did a search and they found all of these different results and vulnerabilities listed out. If you click on these links, by the way, they give you a pretty detailed look at what the vulnerability is. And if you go to the Google Hacking Database, it shows you, for many of these vulnerabilities, in fact, most of them, how to specifically hack that vulnerability. So that is what it's all about. The attacker scans, finds the software or the component of the operating system and the version, lines it up with the vulnerability, and then finds a specific way to hack that vulnerability. So that's why it's very important to be familiar with the vulnerability scoring system, because you can see how bad it is. This one's high, this one's medium, it could be a low one. We're looking at NVD, which I was mentioning before, the National Vulnerability Database. It's a nice little government repository from the United States that has vulnerabilities, has SCAP, which is the Security Content Automation Protocol that's used to represent these. And it enables automation, enables vulnerability management. There are checklists, references, looking at the flaws and misconfiguration issues, product names, and even the metrics. How much of an impact is this going to have? So from the National Vulnerability Database, other vulnerability databases, you can find this information. An attacker can use it to attack. A network defender can use it to defend. If you look at vulnerabilities, that's bad enough, but there can also be just weaknesses. And that is expanded upon in the CWE, which is the Common Weaknesses Enumeration, which gives you system software weaknesses. These are put together and sponsored by the National Security FFRDC, which is owned by the MITRE Corporation, under support of U.S. CERT, National Cybersecurity Division of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. It's a lot of people working together to make sure that you understand weaknesses in programs with 600 categories of weaknesses that can be set up in your organization to find that baseline, identify mitigation and prevention efforts for your organization. So what we want to do is on in your organization, in my organization, on your home network, on my home network, everywhere where there are computer systems, we need to conduct vulnerability assessments. And fortunately for your home network, for small businesses, a lot of the endpoint software that we use, the antivirus software, does this for us. But it's really good to do it on a deliberate basis. First thing is an active assessment where you run a scanner. This could be your endpoint protection on your host, your services, trying to find vulnerabilities. Then there's the external assessment, which is from the outside network. So for instance, right now, open up a tab to Google. So it's not as easy with DuckDuckGo. But if you go to Google and you type in, what's my IP? What's my IP? Or what's my IP address? Hit enter, and it'll show you your IP address, how it looks from the internet. Now, with that IP address, there's a lot you can do. And that is what is used for security assessment. One of the things that I periodically do with organizational IP addresses is drop that IP address into a utility that determines if that IP address has been blacklisted anywhere, right? You can also run a scan against that IP address from the external view, like from somebody who's scanning the network to see if there are vulnerabilities in the firewall, weaknesses in the firewall. That's the external view of the network. We also have the host-based assessment where it's on that Windows 10, on that Windows Server 2019 or Windows Server 2022 host, looking at file systems, registry settings, looking at the potential compromises against the host. And then on the applications, web infrastructure, there could be misconfigurations in the Apache web server or in a Oracle database. There could be outdated content, known vulnerabilities in an IBM DB2 database or something like that. Also, there's a possibility of a passive assessment where we run a sniffer like Wireshark on the network to look to see what communication protocols and methodologies are being used between hosts and discover perhaps vulnerabilities. There's the internal assessment. So the external assessment, you have that external IP address, run a scan against the external network, the external firewalls, the DMZ, from the perspective of somebody on the outside. Now we move into the inside and scan from the internal network to assess vulnerabilities. Also, there are network-based assessments where we scan the entire network, and there are database assessments where we're looking at databases like PostgreSQL, IBM DB2, Microsoft SQL Server, MySQL, stuff like that, right? And look for potential data exposure or maybe SQL injection or maybe other types of maybe misconfiguration of vulnerabilities on a database in particular. Also, we have wireless assessments. So you scan the entire wireless network to try to find problems with it. We have distributed assessments where we have distributed agents simultaneously synchronizing a scan of all the assets. We have credentialed assessments where we get credentials for the network of all machines and use that as part of the evaluation, or non-credentialed, you don't have any credentials on any machines in the enterprise network, and you use that as part of your scan criteria or your vulnerability assessment criteria. We have manual assessments where you take tools like Nmap and others to work with assessing vulnerabilities. And there are many different tools depending on what you're doing. If you're just doing a network, it would be Nmap, but you could use tools to scan web applications, tools to scan databases, tools to scan applications and web servers and so on. So you do it manually though, and you come up with a score, but having automated assessments is always a good first step using things like Nessus and Qualys, GFI LandGuard. There are many different tools that you can automate an assessment of a network and of the applications and devices in that network, and then maybe fall back to a manual assessment if you find some oddities, abnormalities. So what are we going to do with the vulnerability management lifecycle? We're going to, number one, find out what we have. Do asset identification, creating a baseline. Number two, we're going to use all of the techniques or some of the techniques that we saw in the previous page to do a vulnerability scan. So for instance, we might run an automated scan and then move into manual scans for areas that require it. Number three, we do a risk assessment. I like to say that whenever we talk about the word assets and whenever we talk about the word risk, you take that S on these two words and you turn it into a dollar sign. Because with this risk assessment, what we're going to say is, let's say that I find 100 vulnerabilities. Of these 100 vulnerabilities, which one of these is going to cost my organization the most? All right, so I find a vulnerability that if it is used in an attack, it will cause Microsoft Notepad to crash on a system. And it's only on one system there with this vulnerability. All right, let's say I find another vulnerability that if it works, it will cause my HVAC systems in my data center to crash, getting rid of all cooling, heating, and air conditioning in the data center. I wonder which one of those could cost me the most money. Yeah, it's very difficult to decide. Notepad versus the entire data center. Yeah, it's the entire data center, right? That's the biggest risk. Look at dollar signs. If I lose, I have to shut down my entire data center. That's going to cost me so much money. Are you kidding me? So what I do now with my risk assessment is I go to remediation. And the first thing I remediate is the items with the highest risk. So I go find the controls for that HVAC system, and I update the firmware on those controls, and I update the software on the interface, and then I verify that those HVAC controls are no longer vulnerable to attack, and then bringing down my whole data center or something like that. But I've also been working my way all the way down to the low end stuff, and maybe I even remediated the problem on that system that would cause Notepad to crash and tested that too, right? You have to go back through and verify it. But then you have to monitor, because over time, there are new systems, new software, there's updates, there's changes in network configuration that goes on and on. So you have to monitor the things you fixed and monitor all the new stuff that's brought in, and then go back through again. This is a life cycle, and do it again, identifying assets, do a baseline, all the way through.